All right, we should be live. Hello, everybody. We're gonna give a chance for everyone to pile in. Um, Struggling a little bit with the changes. They just released the full version of YouTube Studio, so it's not in beta anymore, and it seems like there's some interesting new stuff involved with going live. Hello, Witchy Poo. By the way, I did send a reply to your comment on the video from the other day. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. I'm sorry that it also took us so long to get back to you. We've been dealing with all the holidays and stuff. So, my deepest apologies. Calon, would you like to, I guess, delve into what we're going to be talking about today? You are still muted, Calon.
Oh, and my sympathies for whatever loss it was as well.
They messaged saying that one of their friends passed away.
Oh, yeah, I know how that is. Oh, by the way, I am the snake. I'm not the hand. Just so you know. Because,
your hair's
that's...
in the shot again.
No, that's not my hair. That's someone else's hair. Because I'm the snake staring into this camera now. We could just have an entire stream with this snake, couldn't we?
So, that said, we did pick a topic for tonight. By the way, Via and Cingeto are both not feeling very well. Cingeto thinks he's down with some kind of illness. So it might be just the two of us tonight. Wolf might pop in for a surprise visit, but we wanted to make sure that we came in and had a discussion for y'all, because it's been a while.
It has. We've had some interesting things in the works, and some interesting things preventing things in the works.
It's been a while.
So, yeah, life. But anyhow, tonight, we are going to answer one of the biggest questions ever.
Or, at the very least, argue about it.
Well, I mean, I'm right on everything, so...
Yeah, sure, Calon.
Name one time I've been wrong.
I can name many times.
No. Name one time I've been wrong, and you thought that or name one time I've been wrong and actually wrong, not one time that you think that I'm wrong, but I'm actually end up being right.
Calling me an atheist.
I mean...
You're wrong.
You were on the atheist channel.
That doesn't make me an atheist. I'm just a bacon host on an atheist channel.
Not the strongest argument there. Strong argument would have been to say that I was also on that channel.
I mean, to be fair, though, you're not one of the organizers of that channel, so you would have just rebutted with, well, I'm not on that channel every stream.
I mean, true. But we can argue about arguments, another arguing time. How many viewers do we have?
We've got 4 at the moment, but we're also competing with John's stream because he decided to stream at the same time as us again.
Can he not?
Apparently he wanted to wait for Naka to get off work.
Again, can he not? Snake, you're being rebellious. Just tell him there's a live snake here.
So, in terms of the free will versus determinism argument, I think that, I know you're more of a compatibilist, but for the sake of having a discussion, do you want to take the defining free will and some of the base arguments in favor of free will to start off with, and then I'll sort of explain determinism, because I'm far closer to the determinist side than most, because I'm a stoic, and I'll explain what all of that means later.
Look up a good definition real quick. So free will, the best way to explain it, sure, I'll defend that position because, why the heck not? Free will is the idea that, let's say I have a set of choices. We'll call them A, B, C, and D. For each one of those choices, there also exists a not choice. That is, not A, not B, not C, not D. So, pineapples or oranges? Well, I could choose pineapples. I can also choose not pineapples. I can choose oranges. I can also choose not oranges. Free will asserts that my choice on whether I choose A, B, or C, or D is not influenced by, is not predetermined.
Well, I mean, free will asserts that you have a choice at all. Basically, the deeper you get into determinism, the more that you find that everything is effectively a chain of cause and effect, which means that there ultimately is no choice, or at least that's what determinism tends to assert.
Right, and determinism, as we know, is this false pseudo-philosophical school that clearly should not deserve to exist.
So basically, the concept of free will is that first off, there is a you know, the mind, and that the mind has the ability to choose at all. So when you have choice A and choice B, you yourself are actually making a choice. That's what free will says. And
Right,
therefore, you are responsible for that choice.
right. I'm choosing right now to show everyone this snake, who is utterly adorable.
So, on the flip side, a lot of people find this to be nihilistic, but determinism states that all things in the universe are the result of effectively cause and effect. So, you know, in this case, you know, you could either say that God's created the universe or the Big Bang happened or whatever, and everything else that has come to be has been a combination of probabilistic chance and the events that has brought about in a chain of cause and effect that ultimately leads to choice A or choice B even being available to you, and that ultimately, whether you pick choice A or choice B, it's actually an illusion of the internal mind's narrator that you had picked anything at all, because those choices are ultimately predetermined by all of the experiences that you have had as an individual, and also all of the chains of cause and effect that have gone on around you.
Right, Allie did not choose. According to Allie's own, to Dogfish Lady's own logic, she did not choose to be here tonight.
Correct. And this isn't. I'm not a 100% determinist, but I do believe that the majority of, you know, life effectively is deterministic just due to the way that physics itself works. So, effectively, my being here tonight had to do with a massive, complex network of probabilistic occurrences that added up to me meeting the people that I have met, me, you know, interacting with the people that I've interacted with, them choosing to, you know, end up, like, them ending up adding me onto the channel, etc., etc., etc. Like, all of these things and the opportunities that they even presented happened because of a series of things that were completely outside of my control. And because all of the events in my life were caused by that same massive network of cause and effect, I ultimately, as a human, don't really have all that much choice because, to a certain degree, I am programmed by the events that have happened in my life to, quote unquote, make certain choices. Meaning that it's not possible for me to choose other things.
Except it is.
And there's where you get the free will versus determinism. How does free will operate if you're going to argue for it?
Free will operates in that there is obviously this thing that we call a self, and this thing is sort of phenomenologically irreducible.
Well, how would you define the self, though, on a physiological level?
The self is an emergent property of the various processes the of the mind.
Okay, well, generally in psychology, the self is defined as the actions, particularly of the prefrontal cortex, also known as the internal narrator. Basically, what you know as yourself is your thoughts, and that segment of your brain actually fires after a decision has already been made by the rest of your brain. In other words, you justify your so called choices after they've already been made, not before.
But right,
And
trying to
those other
think.
parts of the brain are subject to programming based off of cause and effect. They're instinctual. They're not the higher parts of the brain that most of us associate with the self.
But the narrator, it still can speak against the action, though.
Not from the studies that I've seen. The decision to move one's hand is actually made, and those neurons are firing before the realization that the hand is about to move happens in the prefrontal cortex.
Right, but when we talk about something like long-term planning
Well,
and whatnot,
that's the interesting thing, though. The prefrontal cortex can actually be overridden by the older parts of the brain. It's the weakest part of the brain. But
so
But here's the thing, though. If you've never been exposed to a particular piece of information, how could you possibly want it or plan for it? In other words, like any choice that you could make
this is
is
a Plato thing,
any
right?
choice that you could make is entirely based off of the information that you've been exposed to, which itself you have no control over.
But you do have control over it nowadays because you have the ability to go and look for it.
But if you don't know it exists, you can't go look for it.
But you don't necessarily. But one can know that something exists and still not know it.
Okay, if you don't know something exists, how would you seek it out? You have to encounter it. And
Well, let's
in
have.
encountering it, your encountering it or not is not within your control.
Well, let's say I hear of something called a Gorka. What is a Gorka? I have no idea.
Okay,
But
but you hearing of it is not within your control. You did not engineer that you heard of it. You can then seek out information on it based off of the complex physiological processes that'll either catch your interest or not, but you hearing about it is entirely out of your control.
But it's not necessarily out of my control if it's based on other established patterns within my environment. So, in other words, I could abduce that this thing called the Gorka exists in, let's say, various, like let's take ecology for example. They don't necessarily see the main predator in the particular ecological system, but they may be able to infer it based off of population changes, assuming that other factors have been ruled out.
Okay, but again, you can't necessarily control what it is that you observe. You can't control every single piece of that environment or whether or not that predator exists. Being able to deduce something, you are still not in control of that environment. You're not in control of the information that you are exposed to.
But you are in control of taking the measurements up.
Okay, but again, like your desire or, to or not to take those measurements is entirely based off of other environmental factors that you have been exposed to, which yet again, you cannot control. Like,
Is it though, or is it based off of your own values and curiosity?
yeah, but your values and curiosity, how do you learn your values? You're a sociologist, right? Like 90% of your values actually come from your environment. Psychology also shows that your personal
They do, but
makeup
what
has
happens
to do a lot
when you change
with the people you spend the most time with.
right, but what happens when you change your values? People change their values all the time.
But do they change their values out of choice or do they change their values off of new information that they're exposed to? And can they control whether or not they're exposed to that information? You can ignore information that pops into your awareness, but you cannot control whether or not new information exists in your world.
You may not, okay, you can't control whether new information exists, but you can control your awareness of particular information. We see this all the time with people who dismiss global warming, for example.
Okay, but that's willfully ignoring information that is in front of you. You
Right,
cannot
that's the
control
whole
whether
point.
or not it's in front of you.
Right, that's the whole point.
Hey,
Willful.
Via, welcome.
Via's here?
Yep, Via's here.
Hi, Via.
What I'm saying
So,
is if, say, like, let's say you were born and you grow up in a box, and there's nothing in that box but you and whatever scientists bring you. You are completely out of control of the environment. You may not even know that global warming exists, and you have no way to seek out that information.
but I have a way to seek out other information based off of sheer human curiosity.
Except that what you are able to be curious about has entirely to do with that environment that you were raised in. You can only be curious about things that you're aware of. You can't be curious about whether or not global warming or even the sky exists if you've never been exposed to anything other than that box.
But you may be able, you can be curious. You can get down the path towards exploring whether the sky exists or not by saying punching through the box.
Calon, if you weren't exposed to information that there was anything outside of that box, then you'd have no way to know you could punch through the box.
But you don't necessarily need to know something in order to try something.
Generally, you do. It's actually been shown that ideas are generated in the brain based off of external stimuli. If somebody is cut off from external stimuli, those ideas cease.
And the person generally goes pretty insane, actually.
Yeah.
That's why solitary confinement is actually a form of psychological torture.
Yep, it's against the Geneva Convention for all but certain kinds of prisoners. But
we in the U.S. don't worry about something as silly as the Geneva Convention, especially when it comes to prisoners.
Well, we're not talking about politics at the moment.
By the way, for those wondering, I'm not actually a free will. I'm a compatibilist. That is, I hold that free will exists, but that it needs some determinism in order to manifest.
Which is very close to where I tend to argue from. I tend to argue that the closest to control humans can get is your thoughts, and even then, what you're able to think is entirely based off of the information you've been exposed to, and the information you've been exposed to is entirely dependent on your environment, which itself generates the people that you are close to. Basically, what you're able to think entirely is affected by what you are able to access.
There is one thing that it's actually an example from Hume. It's called the color problem. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, does color exist?
No, that's not what the color problem is. Basically, what the color problem is, it's let's say I get a spectrum of different shades of blue. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say between that spectrum, there is a particular kind of blue that does not exist, that's not known to anyone. Would the brain be able to infer what that blue looks like?
Well, we actually discovered this with white, and the answer is technically yes.
So that means without having been exposed to that particular shade of blue, the brain is able to conceive of it, which means it can conceive of stuff without necessarily.
It can conceive the theory that such a thing can exist, but it cannot actually picture it until it has been exposed to it. So in the case of the whitest paint that has ever been created, there was a theory that spectrum could potentially exist in mathematics, and the people had to physically come up with the shade in order to understand what it looked like. So the answer is you can conceive the theory of something existing, but you can't picture it in your mind until you've seen it. In other words, you'd have to use a process other than visualization in order to determine whether or not that blue exists.
Or if it does solve that problem, because that's actually been a pretty real problem for Hume's. It's like one of the few things that can actually sort of tack on to what Hume said, which I assume you've read Hume?
Yes, of course I have. Hume wrote extensively, if I recall correctly, on utilitarianism.
No, that's John Stuart Mill.
Oh, I thought that Hume also wrote on utilitarianism.
Maybe at some point, but
Mill isn't the only writer on utilitarianism.
Hume was more about history and basically being the founder for cognitive sciences. So, he's the one who came up with the idea of distinguishing impressions from impressions from ideas, and that basically blunt impressions always end up forming ideas. That is, everything that you come up with in your mind is some sort of prototype of something that you have seen. No matter how small the detail is, it's some element of something that you have experienced or seen. So a flying pig is made up of a pig and wings, being an example.
Yeah, basically humans can't conceive of ideas beyond combining ideas that they've already been exposed to.
Right. Or elements of ideas, because you can still imagine yourself, for example, on the golden streets of Jerusalem, and that's his exact quote there, even though the golden streets of Jerusalem don't exist.
But you'd combine your conceptualization of Jerusalem, gold, and streets, and you would see all of that together.
Right, you can see and feel it, although it will be of a weaker impression because obviously you're not physically touching it or don't have physical experience with it.
But the interesting thing is, there are actually new shades of like black and white and other colors that are developed and copywritten regularly because when you're talking about color specifically, color is actually frequencies of light. Or rather, color is, the reflection of certain frequencies of light back into the eyes that we can perceive. And so, if we can mathematically determine that a particular frequency exists, we can then experiment with materials until somebody can eventually get to see it. So this is that impression idea combination that Hume talks about. It's actually more reinforcement for that.
Well, yeah, there's a reason why Hume is called the founder of cognitive science.
Well, I mean, what's interesting though is that he does think that our observations of cause and effect are faulty.
Oh yeah, he slaughters the idea of causality and really turns it on his head. That's why I recommend people read a treatise on human nature. It's hefty reading.
Well, the problem is though is the combination like nature versus nurture and all of that. The problem though when you're trying to deal with somebody with, that believes in free will is that the influence of our environment is so incredibly complex and interplays so deeply. Oh, sorry. If anybody just heard something very loud, it was my cat brushing up against my mic.
Can we get cat?
So the interplays between the environment, genetics, and like biology overall, when you're discussing things like, say, neuroplasticity, is so incredibly complex that the idea of nature versus nurture itself is laughable. Like, it's impossible to separate them. Especially when you start getting into things like epigenetics. This is where you get stronger and stronger evidence for things like determinism because we're finding more and more that the environment actually influences things more than we ever thought before.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when it comes to psychology. The way that you think is entirely determined by the experiences that you've had.
Yep, which creates a lot of interesting moral quandaries, although you can have a version of morality within determinism.
Oh yeah, you absolutely can.
You can hold people accountable for various things, but
it changes the way that you view punishment for things like crime, though, particularly when you look into things like, for example, poverty. And this is where a conversation on free will and determinism is effectively impossible to have without delving into politics, because generally free will and determinism tends to be argued about when talking about crime and punishment, primarily. If a person whose family is starving, who is too poor or disabled, etc., unable to provide for their family, steals an apple, should they have their hand cut off? If that's what the law says.
Via, what do you say?
Basically, my whole stance on the thing is that we are like the culmination of our surroundings, and our actions are based off of the stimulus.
Via, you're paying homage to your robot overlords at the moment.
Okay, is now better?
That's better.
Okay, so basically, the way that the place that I stand about it is that we're the culmination of the stimulus that we're presented. Our pure brain chemistry is incapable of changing the way that it reacts. It's going to react the same way to the same stimulus, and because of that, we can't really choose to act any differently. We're just kind of along for the metaphorical ride.
Well, this is where I
Yeah,
disagree a
exactly.
little bit. I believe that to a certain degree, if you're exposed to new information, you actually can change the way that your brain reacts. So, like,
Yeah,
for
but
example,
you
in the
can't
case,
consciously change
I
that. It's just the way that your brain cells are working.
you can to a certain degree positively change that. For example, things like cognitive behavioral therapy have been shown in clinical trials to actually physiologically change the response that an addict's brain has to, say, cigarettes.
Well, that's because it's also a change of the brain wiring, and that isn't that isn't voluntary at all. It's
That
just
is
a way that your
a
brain is
that
going to
is
work.
a change for the way the brain reacts to the same stimulus, though. The change in brain wiring has come as a result of new information, e.g., CBT. You're in the shot again, Calon.
know I am. I'm the snake.
So,
This is me slip.
like, as a stoic, I believe to a certain degree we can actually change how we feel by changing how we think. But in order to change how we think, much like Aristotle states, we have to come into contact with the proper information to change how we think. In other
Yeah.
words, if you haven't discovered that information, you don't have that capability, but if you have, you then have more of what you would call a choice.
Yeah, I completely agree, but still it comes down to chemistry and the way that like everything interacts with each other. And that still means that there can't really be a conscious changing of what's going to happen. And it's I don't know. I am really bad at explaining like my take.
Well, it sounds like you and I are on a similar page, but I think that the primary difference is that your statement is that it's all entirely deterministic regardless, whereas I believe that to a very tiny degree we can as beings, via the prefrontal cortex influence the way the rest of the brain operates, but that it takes a great deal of effort and that one has to have already been exposed to the proper information in order to do so. Basically, one only has a choice once the choice is actually presented.
Yeah, I can completely agree with that.
So, like, I believe that to the extent that we can make choices in this world, they entirely exist at the level of thought, and that thought ripples out and creates emotion, which creates action, which itself can only respond to the outside environment. But that one must have the information available that they even can change their thoughts, which will change their emotions, in order to make that choice.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
And sometimes brain chemistry can interfere with that. Like, for example, if you have PTSD or another panic disorder, you don't necessarily have the choice to stop flashbacking when you are flashbacking. Like, that's not something you can choose to get out of. However, once you're out of the flashbacks and you're starting to recover, if you have that information, you may be able to choose to take steps that you know will calm you down, or you can choose to sit in it and suffer. There are, like, but you have to already have been exposed to the information about what things you can do and what things work specifically for you in order to even make the choice to try to calm yourself down after you've been exposed to flashbacks. This is the Stoic Philosophy 101. Basically, there's something that are called impressions, which, is different than the way that Hume talks about impressions. Impressions are stimulus from the outside world that one is exposed to, or the initial reaction of the emotional mind to that stimulus. Passions are the continuing of that emotion via thoughts. So if you have, for example, the impression of a trigger for somebody who's got PTSD that sends you into horrible, horrible flashbacks, then you can, once you're out of those flashbacks, you will have the impression often of sadness or fear or anger or whatever it is, that you felt from those memories. You then may have the capability of making a choice to do breathing exercises or journaling or listening to music or any number of other coping mechanisms, call a friend, etc., in order to bring yourself calm, but only if you have the information available to you that those things are going to help. You can't make a choice to not have the flashbacks, but you can try to make the choice to calm yourself down once you're out of them. That's kind of what I'm talking about. And this is coming from the perspective of somebody who has extremely severe PTSD. So I'm not being condescending whatsoever to people who still suffer from it.
Right.
Like, this is coming out of my daily life. In fact, Calon and Via have both talked to me after I've had flashbacks.
I've talked to you during when you've had them. So, now for the counter argument, making a case for free will. Well, first we have to determine what a self is. And a self can be seen as composed of various sort of forces and environmental exposure. Some of this stuff is determined, but it seems like that our attitudes towards various things somehow isn't.
So can I interrupt really quick? Can I ask, Witchy Poo, you said, what? There's a slight delay on the stream and the chat. I'm curious what it is that you were, confused about, like, in that particular section of the discussion. It's gonna take a second. My apologies for dead air, everybody. I'm just curious, because we only have 3 watchers at the moment. Oh, okay. Really thinks that it was a response to her.
Oh.
Copious
So,
viewers.
Just looking it up, and it says, however, these studies of timing brain in understanding free will. A subject's declaration of intention to move a finger appears after the brain has begun to implement the action, suggesting to some that unconsciously the brain has made the decision before the conscious mental act to do so. Some believe the implication is that free will was not involved in the decision and is an illusion. The first of these experiments reported the brain registered activity related to the move about 0.2 for the movement. However, these off.
Calon, you are cutting out really bad. It's hard to understand
For
you.
participatory, and
Calon, you need to repeat yourself. You like 90% of that just got lost.
Oh. Okay, I said during these studies, 3 studies of the timing between actions and the conscious decision bear upon the role of the brain in understanding free will. A subject's declaration of intention to move a finger across the brain has. Sorry, I must. It's because I just read this. Okay. So, basically, what it's saying is that there have also been studies that have found that the awareness of an action was anticipatory to activity in the muscle underlying the movement. The entire process resulting in action involves more steps than just the onset of brain activity. The bearing of these results upon notions of free will appears complex.
Well, and this is what I was trying to say about nature versus nurture earlier, right? Like, when you talk about, for example, here's another contentious thing, gender roles, right? Like, you and I have had complex discussions and not so nuanced discussions with angry assholes on Twitter about gender roles. Like, people argue, well, 3 and 4-year-olds start performing gender roles. Yes, but it's shown that as early as 2.5 years old, children can start observing gender roles in their environment. And as early as when they're born, if a person knows a baby's gender, they will treat them differently. Meaning that, whether they're encouraged to be more, say, independent or are coddled more is determined entirely on what gender they are perceived to be by, the other people.
Which, by the way, there is an interesting side note here. There are some studies which have indicated that languages which employ gender-neutral pronouns, like Finnish, Turkish, generally have their children realize their gender later on than those with non-gender-neutral languages.
Yeah, and then there's
Just an
languages
interesting
like
side note.
Chinese in which the spoken word is the same regardless of the gender. He, she, and it are all the same word, though they're written
Ta,
differently. Ta.
like ta.
Mm-hmm. Ta. Um, so like if you write it, you
Now we're
know
gonna
what
give you all
gender
a
you're
Chinese.
referring to, but if you don't, then ta just means, the only way that you'd know what gender the pronoun is referring to is by the context of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So you find actually something very similar in a lot of different Asiatic languages. Like there's more of a collectivist ideal, and it's kind of reflected in the languages.
Right. Skinna, you are active.
So what ends up happening a lot of the time, again, is that identity is, and again, as a sociologist, I know that you'll agree with me to a certain extent. Identity is formed in large part by the environment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
Identity really isn't a function of nature. It's more like a response. It's more like a response to nature, if that makes sense.
it's a response to stimulus that is crafted within what the body is physiologically capable of. In other words, if you're
Right.
exposed to ultraviolet light, you may not necessarily know it unless you get a sunburn. So you can't really respond to said ultraviolet light unless you're the one person on Earth that can physically see it.
If only there were people. What nature? Why did you have to give us such a limited range of the visual spectrum?
Because our eyes are primarily good at seeking out fruit. That's what we evolved from.
Yeah, true. Like this little creature that I'm actually holding right here, he can see ultraviolet light.
He can also taste infrared too, can't he?
I actually haven't heard that part, but it's possible.
Infrared
I'll
is
ask
heat,
him.
and I've
You know,
read infrared is heat, and I've read that like snakes can taste heat with their tongues.
can you do that, Skeena? Are you hiding stuff from me? You are, aren't you?
So,
So,
like for example, if infrared exists, you may not be able to see it, but you might be able to feel it with your hand.
or
Heat
you
that's
might be
coming
able
off
to
of
look at a
something.
snake and see that the snake is moving, and you're like, okay, maybe I should move too. That's the other way.
So, in other words, you cannot respond to stimuli that you are not exposed to. If there was something that was invisible and existed on a plane outside of you, unless it had some way to infiltrate your body's perception, you would not be able to respond to it. Which, I guess, when you're starting to talk about free will and determinism, this is where we start to get into some complicated things when you start talking about monotheism versus polytheism. Because monotheism holds very strongly to the concept of free will, but completely ignores the environmental impact. In fact, both the main three monotheistic religions kind of argue that it's possible to fully ignore, by immersing yourself in their particular version of culture, all of the influence of your environment and your physiology, for that matter, when it comes to the no sex before marriage type stuff.
And there's seemingly some basis to this as well. I know in Jainism, they have, when you get older and you dedicate yourself to sort of the monastic lifestyle of a Jain monk, presuming you have community support and yada yada yada, they will starve themselves to death for the virtue of ahimsa, which basically means non-violence, because they see eating, living anything as something that can make any a form of karma. Which, by the way, karma in Jainism is different. It's not. There is no good karma in Jainism.
But in terms of like that, though, you're in an environment that allows you to do that and have been exposed to information that has convinced you that overriding your body's physiological systems is what's best for you. And you're in an environment while living that life as a monk where that is possible. If you were in a room surrounded by food, it might be significantly harder to starve yourself because parts of your brain would override your free will. Which is part of the reason it's very, very hard to deliberately drown yourself, for example.
Um, trying to think. I think there are some examples, though, of that impulse being overcome as well.
It's possible with certain modifications to brain chemistry, but it's very, very difficult. This is why a lot of people who want to commit suicide often don't follow through unless they have the sort of depressive, like malfunctions of the brain going on at the same time. It's very hard if you're not, like, maniacally depressed, like if you're not deeply, deeply in the throes of depression, to just decide to kill yourself. Like, your brain will immediately kick in the lower functions to defend you from that thought. However, if parts of the brain are malfunctioning, for example, if serotonin reuptake isn't functioning properly, or if you're resistant to it, or you're not producing enough dopamine, then those things can cause your brain to allow the suicidal ideation to continue and eventually act on it, because those parts of the brain are malfunctioning. This is part of the reason why, by the way, if you're having depression problems, you should definitely seek treatment.
Right. Some cases of... have you heard of self-mummification?
You're cutting out really bad again, Calon.
Allie?
Nothing.
Have you heard of self-mummification?
No, I haven't.
Right,
though everybody's just seeing a white window now.
What? Yeah, it's because... hold up. There's a little bit of a brief interruption. All right. Is this better?
It hasn't come up yet. You haven't turned your camera back on yet.
It's on.
It's not showing up. Oh, there we go.
All right. Have you heard of self-mummification?
No, I actually haven't.
So that's a Buddhist practice in which the individual mummifies themselves to death.
But again, you'd have to be in an environment and be exposed to information where one would be willing to do that.
Well, it's an example of the... it's called... oh, by the way, it's called Sokushinbutsu. Sokushinbutsu. And there's actually so the monk observes asceticism to the point of death and entering a mummification while alive. They are seen in a number... yeah.
Okay, you keep reading like half of it. Either read it all or like try to summarize it.
That's what I'm doing, while also managing a snake to keep people entertained. All right. So basically, these people, while they are alive, will go ahead and start putting mummification chemicals in their body while also starving themselves to death.
By the way, we should probably put a trigger warning down at the moment. If you are currently contemplating suicide or are concerned about discussions of things like suicide, this is your trigger warning that we're going to be getting more deeply into that topic beyond just a very surface level free will versus determinism discussion.
Okay. So there are only 24 known Sokushinbutsu that are known. The most famous, one of the most notable cases being because this monk is still on display, of Luang Po Dayen. I think that's how you pronounce it. Whose mummified body is still in the same pose as when he died back in 1973.
Well, and
so basically these people have been able to practice to such a point to where they could override any sort of natural defenses against, well, this ultimate end.
Well, and to a certain degree, that's evidence of things like neuroplasticity, the ability for the prefrontal cortex to grow in density as such, so dense that it can override other parts of the brain. But again, that's also responds to a certain degree to external stimulus. You have to be exposed to the information that this is possible and then diligently work toward it day in and day out until it's possible to do so. This is very similar to the people who can slow their heart almost to a stop during deep, deep meditation.
Aren't they also Buddhist monks?
Some are Buddhist monks, and there's also, like, practitioners of certain other religions that involve trance states. There have been shamans who can do it.
So, in other words, people, the more prefrontal cortex you build up, the more power you get.
And this is where I remind everybody that mine is underdeveloped because I have ADHD. Anyway, so coming back to, like, earlier somebody asked, where ultimately, like, this leaves things like the supernatural. And this is where I'm not sure if we're all going to have the same answer to this question, but I'm actually curious, given Via, you are eclectic, but you also worship the gods, some of them. I'm curious where you sit, given the response to stimulus.
I basically think that, like, the gods can also give us that stimulus, and I don't know if I, like, really understand the question.
Well, do you believe, I guess I'll try to rephrase it to be a two-part and slightly more specific. The first part is, do you believe that the gods are subject to cause and effect the way that we are? And second, do you believe that they themselves can be a cause? It sounds like you answered the second part of that question already, though.
I think that gods are kind of, like, outside of that cause and effect. I think that, if anything, they're the sole, like, actual conscious beings of this universe that, like, actually have a choice that's not cause and effect oriented.
I think another version of this question is also known as Euthyphro's dilemma. Do the gods love good because it is good, or, is it good because the gods love it? In other words, are the gods outside of the laws of the universe? Calon, what do you think?
I think that the gods are both intertwined with the universe and transcendent.
Okay, can you explain that a little more deeply?
That is basically they are within this universe. That is, there are many divine beings we call gods that are within this universe in various forms, but I'm also not limiting it to just this reality. There's also ultimate reality. Especially since I'm an animist, I hold that things like the moon and whatnot are literal gods. Now, they're not necessarily omnipotent gods or anything like that. They have their limitations, and we can explore them scientifically, but I still see it as a sort of living entity.
I'm sort of different in that because I'm not absolutely certain whether the gods came into being with the universe as was proposed by a number of different creation myths via the Greeks. As a Hellenist, I'm torn. On the Platonist side of my religion, they state that the gods are both an integral part of within the universe and also outside of it, and that they feed it in their transcendent aspects and interact with it in their direct aspects. However, they are also unmoved by it, meaning they are unaffected. They can turn their gaze to you, but your existence doesn't change them or affect them in any way. I'm closer to believing that the gods are, to a certain degree, affected by cause and effect. That my experience shows that they do seem to interact with us directly. And that things like, say, for example, calling a particular person, I don't think people just feel that call. I think that the gods have a place in it. And that in order for a god to have a place in that call, they have to be able to interact with cause and effect. Meaning
Gods
that
are
to
the only
huh?
free will. Gods are the only ones who possess free will.
Effectively, yes. That's my belief. I think that they
Yeah,
are
I
affected by cause and
hardly
effect,
agree
but I
with that.
believe that they also have free will.
So,
And
what does free will mean for a god?
well, for a god, I believe free will would probably mean that they can choose what effect they have on reality.
Whereas we can't choose what effect we have on reality.
Correct, we're entirely products of the cause and effect of the world around us. I think this is part of the reason why gods are so hard to find, so to speak. If they don't want to be found, they won't be. If they do, they will.
Hey, Snake.
Whereas you can't
Yeah.
blink yourself out of everybody else's perception at a will. You don't have that kind of power.
A meat grinder does.
I think that the gods are intimately, like, if you were to talk about them from the laws of physics perspective, I think they're intricately woven with the plane of existence that governs things like probability, and I think that they work from that level. So I think our perceptions of them are entirely engineered by those manipulations of probability.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
It's the closest to an explanation from an empirical sense I've ever been able to find for the gods.
Basically probability.
Well, I think that they operate from probability. Like, I think they can influence it. I think they can change the universe by changing the way that probability functions.
Probability sucks. I failed that in math.
I love probability. It's such a confusing philosophical concept until you really sit down and think through it.
Well, I mean, like, for example, when you start talking about quantum mechanics, which I know is a really big buzzword in cults and shit, but, like, I'm talking about this from a scientific perspective. You know, things like, say, protons or quarks pop into and out of existence constantly. Like in dead space. They just do. That's how matter seems to come into existence now. So, if a god could influence how many of those, say, protons come into existence and conglomerate together, if they could tip that probable scale, if they existed on some sort of plane that allowed them to do so, they could create a universe via just a few adjustments to probability. They could cause a miracle to happen through a few adjustments to probability. They could fuck with your brain so that you perceive them briefly, even though you don't have any sort of mental disorder that would cause a hallucination. Like, it makes sense that all of the things that the gods are able to do would come about through manipulations of probability. They would work
Exactly.
within the laws of the universe rather than outside of them. But they would appear to be outside of them to us because we aren't able to do what they do.
So this raises an interesting question, though. Do you believe in apotheoses?
Give a definition for the group, by the way.
Apotheosis is the process of a human becoming a god. This process has been held up culturally by culture such as the Chinese, as well as like
Sounds
the
very Mormon to me.
well, what, as well as even the Romans in the imperial cult. You could maybe argue that ancestor worship can come into this, but ancestors in an ancestral cult tend to be viewed as lesser spirits, if that makes sense.
I don't know if humans can become gods. I really don't. I believe that some part of us does live on after we die, but I don't know if that part of us will move on to a probabilistic plane, or even if an evolved mind could potentially, reach the level of a disembodied mind. For folks who are not familiar with this, by the way, this has to do with a particular philosopher who set about defining the gods from a Hellenist perspective primarily. And they define the gods as as disembodied minds with profound greatness, meaning power beyond full human comprehension, that instilled a feeling of awe upon contact with humanity, that are eternal. effectively.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Witchy Poo says that you have pretty hair.
It's actually really ugly, but thanks.
And by the way, Witchy Poo, I'm noticing your comments about, if anything matters, and sometimes grief can mess with the brain a lot and make this sort of despair settle in to where, things that felt like they were important before don't anymore. If it continues for too much longer after your friend's death, you might want to talk to your doctor about, or your psychiatrist, because you mentioned that you're taking medication, about medication or about additional counseling and such, because no longer caring about things that you once did is one of the big symptoms of depression. And it's normal to feel that way for a little while after grief, but if it continues for a long time, that's not as normal. If that makes sense. Things generally do get better on the other side of grief, and it's terrible that you lost your friend. When I was 22, my best friend from my entire life killed herself, and I felt that way for over a month. And I still have moments where I find that sadness creeping back in when I think of her. But at the same time, I think, my faith in the gods also sort of comforts me, and this isn't meant to be manipulative or converting. A lot of Christians will come in, swoop in like, freaking devils and be like, oh, well, maybe they went to heaven if they had faith in Jesus Christ. But, like, for me, my faith, my belief that, suicide doesn't automatically land you in a bad place in the Hellenist faith. It actually just puts you kind of where all the normal dead are. And that's not a terrible place to be. The Elysian fields are kind of what you'd be talking about there. And so, to me, I know that someday I'll meet her again. And that brings me comfort. If she ended herself, it simply means that her brain couldn't handle the pain from the stimulus in her life. And that's part of where Stoicism comforts me.
For me, when because I've had a number of people kill themselves, some friends and whatnot, even a close partner. The way I think of it is basically their body was just simply too sick to hold on to the part of their being that is intrinsic, their essence, so to speak. And so basically they ended up going down to what in the Norse tradition is known as hell, so that hell herself could take care and fix what was wrong, and then possibly they will be back.
So
that's how I.
In a way, like, this isn't an encouragement for suicide whatsoever, mind you. Like, it simply is a recognition that there are times where those we love. I'll rephrase this a little bit. There was something brilliant that I read a while ago, and maybe this will help, maybe it won't. We'll try to get back to the discussion in a minute for anybody who's frustrated with us going off on the side. But I read once that grief is actually pressure inside the self from an outflowing of love. Basically, you had this person in your life that you loved deeply, and now they're gone, and so you don't have anywhere to put that love anymore. And so it hurts because there's this pressure building inside you. And eventually, things will calm down, you'll readjust. There's still that little piece that's missing, there's still that little connection that you're looking for, that, stimulus, so to speak, the way that we were talking about earlier, that, that person picking up the phone, or the way that they looked at you, or things of that nature. But eventually, like all other things, your body kind of adjusts back to the amount of love that you now have the capacity to give. But ultimately, part of the reason why, when you stop and think about someone who's died, even years later, there's that little pang of loss, is because you still remember all the love you gave to that person. And so right now it's natural to feel this hurt. It's normal to grieve when you lose someone. And sometimes it's normal to have a crisis of faith. Anybody who judges you for that is not necessarily, they're not necessarily in the right or being positive. But what I can say is that short of developing clinical depression, it does get a little bit easier to deal with time. Also, Calon, you've got an echo. I'm gonna mute you.
I shouldn't because I haven't been talking.
Well, you had an echo of my voice, like it was coming through your speakers or something.
Weird. I've been managing a playful snake. Yeah, you are active. But, yeah.
But I think that this is one of those places. Can you mute when you're not talking, Calon? Because my voice is definitely coming through your speakers or something. I'm hearing an echo.
Shouldn't be me.
It is you. Like, I'm watching you light up.
Calon, your mic.
Calon, your mic! It wouldn't be SNS without it. Alright, fine, I'll mute you. So, effectively, what I'm saying is, to a certain degree, a crisis of faith is fairly normal, and it's okay. There's also the ability, if you find strength in it, and if it helps you, to lean on your faith in times like this as well. Reminding yourself that that person didn't go to some place of eternal suffering. More than likely what happened is they were either reborn or they went into an afterlife that most likely was not determined based off of whether or not they had sex with people. You know what I mean? There are times when our bodies fail us, but I personally believe that there's a part of us that does go on. And as much as it gives fuel to the atheist, oh, religion is for comfort, blah, 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 my relationship with the gods is a lot more than just that to me. And I know it is to a lot of other pagans as well. And so, if you're struggling, if you're hurting right now, that's normal. If it helps to think of your faith, then lean on it. If it doesn't and you're having a crisis of faith, take the opportunity to stop and think and explore the gift that you've been given in that regard too. Loss is painful and it's difficult and it's something that all of us go through. It's human. And in my opinion, at the very least, I know that my gods understand that, and I'm pretty sure yours will too. So, sidebar done, I guess. I hope that that was helpful though, Witchy Poo. Like, we do care about you guys, and I'm sorry to hear that you're going through this, but I'm hoping that the things that we've said are in any way helpful. We are getting pretty close to the hour mark. Do we have anything more to say on free will and determinism?
There's no free will without the gods.
Gods.
That's what... Yeah, we laugh at that, but I wonder if there are any polytheists who actually hold to that.
Divine command theorists.
Oh, those people. I forgot they exist, don't they?
Well, I'm glad that we were able to be helpful. And honestly, indulging in things like arts and crafts, Witchy Poo, like taking care of yourself, indulging in self-care, and letting yourself feel that sadness, being okay with the fact that you're grieving right now and that's where you're at, that can be very helpful too. Sometimes grief is extended over long periods because we try to run away from it. But if you take focus on taking care of yourself, and if your relationship with is it Brigid or is it Bried? I'm not sure. I've heard it pronounced both ways. If your relationship with the goddess is helping you, then lean on that. One of my favorite quotes ever, and this is from a Hellenist perspective, but you can apply it to pretty much any god, is, don't tell Athena how big your problems are, tell your problems how big Athena is. And I think, in some ways, the gods have seen it all, right? They've watched billions of humans through history grow up, live full lives, and die. They've seen every problem, every thought, every doubt, every fear, every bit of sadness, every joy, every triumph, everything happen billions of times over. And so, if it comes to it, leaning on them, they'll know how to help you. And sometimes times like this can make your relationship with them stronger if that's what you want. So, is there anything else that we want to say before the end of the stream and folks head over to the after show? I can't make the after show tonight because in a few minutes I gotta go make sure that my friend can get home. A buddy of mine is over getting insulin because he's been really sick the last 2 days without it. Type 1 diabetic and all that. So I'm gonna have to get him going home pretty soon. Calon, do you have anything more you want to say before we do a wrap up? And of course, like shilling.
You cut.
You're having some tech issues, Calon.
I said no. You covered it pretty well.
Okay. Via, do you have anything more to say?
Not really.
All right. So, folks, Calon and I are working on a couple of interesting things, including a collaborative with a Raging Atheist channel. Calon, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, basically we'll be tackling some focus. I won't name them yet, but that's coming up pretty soon. We just need for a few people to get back, and that's going to be fun. Oh, and also Ali and I are working at going after some another focus, theology.
Yep.
Because screw focus. Well, no, don't screw them. That's way too pleasurable. They can go screw themselves. Yeah.
With spiked gloves. So I've got some fun announcements. On Friday, I'm actually going to be going on Modern Day Debate because somebody who had chickened out of debating me is coming back with the stupidest topic that I've ever heard. So this is going to be interesting.
What is it?
Is the Heracles myth a copy of Samson and Goliath?
What kind of stupid trash is that?
Or of Samson, a gentleman who got his hair cut and lost all his strength. So not Samson and Goliath. It would have been David and Goliath, but it was Samson. You know, his story. Is Heracles a copy of that?
The weird long-haired dude that lost all his strength for like cutting off like strands of hair.
And this is why you should never cut your hair, people.
Yep. So yeah, apparently, it's Nephilim free. I believe is the person that I'm going to be debating.
Oh God, you're going up against that idiot.
It was the only debate that Modern Day Debate wanted me in for this particular time. He apparently challenged me to it. You know, I can help him by suggesting which hero was actually more like that myth, but still, both of those myths predate the earliest Bible manuscripts. So
yeah, so Nephilim free is a nobody, just so you know.
Yeah, I don't know why I was challenged to it. It'll at least be entertaining for some people, I guess.
It's like Vosh going against Jesus is Lord.
Yeah, but I mean, again, like, I've only been on the channel once, so it'll be interesting. So yeah, if you guys want to see that particular shit show, that's happening on Friday. Also, if Pig Puncher does not get back to me by tonight, Rilla, you will be our guest for Thursday over on a Raging Atheist channel, which I help to co-hosts. We're going to be doing a discussion on disability rights. As far as far as I know, I'm gonna have to catch up with Naka to make sure that that's the plan, because there was, we've ended up having that change last minute before, and there's some drama going on in the community right now that Nock's been on top of. But last he and I had talked, that was what the plan was for this week, was Rilla is going to be coming on. So, thank you so much for joining us on Styx and Stonehenge. We're sorry that this one went on for a little while, but I think it was a pretty in-depth discussion, and we talked on some pretty heavy topics. So, hopefully we will see you guys over at the after show, and thank you so much again for joining us. It was wonderful, and thank you for making it, by the way, Via. Like, I'm glad that you were able to.
So am I. This definitely helped a lot more than I thought it would.
Yeah, I didn't expect for us to get into such heavy topics, but I'm actually really glad we did, because it seems like as small and kind of intimate as a stream as it was.
Also, Via, you see this? You're on snake cam duty soon.
Oh god, okay.
Turtle cam!
No, not even turtle cam.
Alternating snake and turtle cam.